Hello and good morning, everybody. It's me, Julian, and welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. Today, if you'll permit me, I'd like to talk about Flaubert's masterpiece, Madame Bovary. Specifically, I would like to make an argument about what you might call the vicissitudes of the realist novel, which is to say one of the ironies of realism as a quote-unquote genre, although let us not forget that Flaubert did not want to be associated with such a label. One of the ironies of realism is that realist novels aren't actually realistic, which is to say it's not a documentary effort to depict the world as it is. Instead, and this is really important, the true essence of realism as a literary innovation is that it tries to put its finger on what in Lacanian psychoanalysis would be called the real. That imperceivable gap or dissonance, that tension between the idealized substance of our imagination and desire versus the burgeoning awareness, indeed, the devastating loss that occurs when we discover that at the heart of this symbolic thing, there is nothing but void or lack, which is to say, as soon as we have the thing we thought we wanted, it turns out to be already symbolically void. Indeed, the titular character, Emma Bovary, is someone who is well-read, who enjoys romantic and idealized notions of love, who feels unhappy and unfulfilled in her own ordinary and yet nevertheless very decent marriage, and goes in search of such spiritual and idealistic fulfillment, only to find something empty within the very pursuit of it. It's a bit how, and of course Flaubert gently satirizes this, to have a lover, once it becomes routine, becomes perhaps even more tedious than to be in an ordinary marriage. And whilst much has been written about the way in which Flaubert uses this novel to skewer the vanities and hypocrisies of his own time, be it the spiritual and cultural aspirations of the clergy, or the self-professed positivist scientism of secular individuals who simply seek status in life, such as the character of the pharmacist in this book, who, not receiving the Légion d'honneur, creates a little garden patch that resembles the desired medal so that he can claim he has it nonetheless. These bourgeois vanities are skewered in this novel to great comedic effect. And yet there's certain passages in here that I think very effectively illustrate the true power of realism. In fact, I think you could say that Flaubert, in a sense, invents the psychoanalytic novel. Although, before we start giving Flaubert perhaps too much credit, I want to briefly talk about Henry James. Because Henry James, in his notes, elaborated what you might call micro-stories. It's a distinctly modernist gesture in the same way that Kafka was able to have like a rewriting of the Odyssey in a paragraph in his diaries. Henry James would work out ideas for stories that he would then never actually write, and yet, in a sense, in their very miniature form, they contain the full scope and power of their idea. And one such story that Henry James lays out in his notes is based on a conversation that he has at a dinner party. And the story goes like this. There's a man who all he wants to do is just read. He just wants to be left alone to read. And so he retreats into his reading room and he picks up a book. And yet at the very moment that he sits down to focus, his wife comes in. Because his wife really wants to read as well, but she doesn't really like reading, especially not by herself. And so she imagines to herself that if she can enjoy the company of her husband who loves to read, that she will become a reader herself. And yet as soon as she sits down with him, he can no longer focus, and so he gets up and leaves. And then she is left in this room reading by herself, And yet it no longer is pleasurable to her. She's no longer really reading. She doesn't have the idea of the reader to accompany her, the idea of the ideal reader, so that she can stage for herself the fantasy of a cozy moment. Never has there been a more psychologically and psychoanalytically devastating illustration of the Schopenhauerian maxim that when you buy a book, you should ideally also be buying the time to read it. Which is to say, what Henry James does so well is that in this little comedic vignette, which, if I remember correctly, is actually made even more devastating by the fact that the man leaves altogether, that he divorces her, and so she's left alone in his former library, trying to enjoy that which she never had access to. But beyond that, what makes it such an interesting little vignette is that it points towards the gap between the expectation underlying our desire and the impossibility of actually realizing it or fulfilling it. Which is to say, not only does the woman need the idea of the reader, the performative reading, in order to want it, but when she's actually doing, she can't access it. It slips through her fingers like so much sand. And you could say the same thing is true for love in Flaubert's Madame Bovary, which is to say that Emma has an idea of what she thinks love is, and yet she needs someone else. She needs an other to unlock it within her. And whenever she is with someone she believes she loves, she asks herself the characteristically hysteric question, which is this truly love? Am I finally experiencing the thing? She never fully has access to it. There's always a gap. In fact, there's a beautiful scene that is very notorious in this novel, in which she finally consummates her love with an affair with a man called Leon, who she first met as a young clerk, as a student, and they bonded over their shared love for books. In fact, they're both living in the countryside, and they feel culturally stunted, and they imagine themselves intellectuals. And so the fact that he also enjoys reading means that she thinks that she likes him and vice versa. They both believe in the idea of love, or to put it in Nietzschean terms, they are in love with the idea of love itself. They don't necessarily love each other, they love the idea of being in love with each other. And so they go through the motions. And it is an unconsummated love, and yet eventually, in the city, in Rouen, they meet. And here comes the famous passage, because they meet in a carriage, and the carriage goes through the city. In fact, Flaubert has this list. He used the stylistic device of a list of all the places that the carriage goes through, so as to suggest how long they are in the carriage. And he doesn't actually describe the romantic encounter or the affair as such, which is to say he leaves it to our imagination. And this is precisely what makes it so scandalous. After all, if this had been written in an earlier time, in a romantic novel, it could have just been, and they gave themselves to their passions. This would have been totally fine for the censors. Yeah, you can imagine it, but you can't describe it. And yet what Flaubert did, which is so provocative, is that he doesn't actually ever say, and they gave themselves to their passion. Instead, he makes us draw the inference. He places the dirty thought in our collective heads as the readership, meaning that we become complicit in the very desire projected upon this couple. We want them to be doing it in this carriage. Now, granted, he gives us two very strong hints. One, that the carriage appears to be rocking like a ship on choppy waters. He describes other people looking at the carriage. And finally, and this is perhaps the most beautiful cinematic motif, for this is something that Flaubert does so well, is that he has a very cinematic way of rendering his quote-unquote shots, his scenes, is that Madame Bovary had entered into the carriage carrying a little letter, a note, in which she had written all the reasons why she wasn't going to have an affair. And at a certain point, the black curtain of the carriage parts, and we see the elegant, slim hand of Emma Bovary. And the little scraps of this letter, which have now been torn up, are cast out of the window. And here in this deliciously coquettish moment, we have not the act, nor the cinematic, putting your pants back on afterwards, but we have this image of the hand, which was able to go into the amorous encounter precisely because it claimed not to want to. Which is to say, the true radical content of the scene lies precisely in the gap between her professed non-desire to be with Léon and the ultimate consummation of the amorous affair. And that gap is what makes it realistic. The very reason that she can have an affair with Léon is precisely because she intends not to. What allows her to get into the carriage is not, I want to make love to you, but it is, I am a virtuous woman who will hand you this letter telling you that you are a scoundrel and it could never be between us. Her very resistance to the act is what creates the preconditions for its fulfillment. And in this dialectical tension, we have the essence of the realist novel and what makes it so radical and provocative, indeed, especially to the censors. And once again, the censors wouldn't have minded a slightly risque romantic novel in which people could engage in the harmless process of imagining themselves to be like the characters, to live vicariously through them. No, what is dangerous about the realist novel is precisely that it exposes, that it lays its finger on the wound of the very dissonance of subjectivity, the very hypocrisy of subjectivity, how we do something precisely because we profess not to. And this is a theme that carries through the entire novel. There is no one here who acts in direct concordance with their beliefs or stated principles. In fact, what makes it a realist novel is that it not only suggests that all of our conceptions about our own identity and our worldview are, in a sense, flawed, but that they, in many ways, lead us into the opposite realm. For example, the desire to use medicine as a sign of progress can often be a way of trying to create status and social standing for oneself. The cleric's desire to bring people to God is in fact a tacit way of relishing their civilizational and cultural superiority over others. There's a wonderful little gag here in which we have a tiny dispute between the idea of Catholicism and Protestantism, in which a clergyman basically says that, well, everything is in the Bible. And then someone says, well, what if people learn to read the Bible? And he says, no, we're not Protestants. We're not those types of religious people. Which is to say, it's all about affect. It's about using and manipulating ideas and principles and identities so as to hide your own, if you will, vanities and affectations. And that's something that Flaubert loves to skewer. Now, I'd like to briefly talk about a couple of scenes here that I think stand out as good examples of Flaubert's quote-unquote realist style. And once again, I'd like to say that his realism is distinctly not the realism of depicting things as they are. It is not a documentary style. Instead, to reiterate, his realism is precisely one which traces the contours of the outlines of the gap, the dissonance between our professed desires and our inability to fulfill them. Which is to say, this is a book about what you might call the Lacanian Real. And one of the scenes that I think is very important here, that is distinctly not realistic, i.e. it is very theatrical, it's very, very staged, is the figure of the blind man, the blind vagrant, who is described in a very grotesque way as having sort of bleeding eye sockets and green gangrenous skin. And whenever one of the carriages, that contains passengers, comes by this man, he sort of engages in a performance of what it means to be a depraved, homeless individual. In fact, the passers-by, as we later will learn, want him to act in this way. They will even give him money. Moreover, Emma Bovary will give him the very last of her money, as she herself is heading into financial ruin, so that he can play the role of the fool. And there's a scene that's so beautiful, and it's very dark. It inverts, essentially, the scene in which we see the hand of Emma Bovary extending outside of the carriage. For as she is going back home to her comfortable bourgeois existence, she is in this carriage, and suddenly the head of this blind, grotesque man protrudes into the carriage, and his empty eye sockets appear to be looking at her. And here we have so much going on. We have the beautiful, ironic inversion of the grace of her hand, which extends outside the carriage as a symbol of her dalliance, versus the grotesquerie of the head without eyes, which sees without sight, entering into the carriage, the private space of her amorous encounter, although it is another carriage, and confronting her, as it were. And here we also have the foreshadowing of what will be Emma's death, her ending. For as she is struggling to die, and here once again we have a beautiful example of the irony implicit in Flaubert's psychoanalytic realism. For Emma Bovary chooses to die. She takes arsenic, which she steals from the pharmacist, and she lays down and she imagines to herself that now she will have a perfectly pretty death, that dying will be altogether easy. And yet nothing could be less true. She suffers immensely. She has a grotesque death, her tongue lolling out of her mouth, black bile issuing from it even after her death, her eyes rolling up. She spasms for pages and pages. She has the most agonizing and least romantic, least perfect death. She does not simply close her eyes and pass beautifully. Instead, she goes in such a manner as to make even the staunchest people want to faint. And so again, an example of the gap between the expectation of our desire, our imagination, versus the reality of it. And yet, as Emma lies here convulsing, as she is about to pass, she's already in her death rattle, she suddenly sits up and she hears from outside, a very haunting scene, a very uncanny Hoffmannian scene. She hears the mocking, as it were, song of the blind man outside, who is reciting verses of a romantic poem and ditty about a young woman who gives herself up to love. Nothing is realistic about this in a documentary sense, which is to say nothing here is, oh yeah, that would have happened. Instead, what makes it realist is precisely that it draws out, through juxtaposition and contradiction and irony, the vicissitudes, indeed the psychological deceptions, of a romanticism an sich, which is to say this is a romantic, anti-romantic novel. And in this moment of the blind man's utterance, his singing the romantic song, Madame Bovary hears him with horror on her face as a kind of grotesque version of her own failures to consummate such love, and she passes. It's an incredibly dark and affecting scene, immediately followed by some very impressive, psychologically realistic depictions of the grief of her husband, who cannot understand why Emma chose to throw herself away. After all, he is a good husband. He has a good life. He gave her everything objectively that one could expect from a marriage and what one might require in order to be happy. And yet Emma did not know how to be happy. Moreover, perhaps she did not want to be happy. And this indeed is what makes Flaubert's novel a prototypical feminist tract, which is to say, Emma is not merely a heroine through which the female reader can live a vicarious life of fantasy, nor is she a victim of social circumstance. Instead, what makes her a quote-unquote feminist anti-hero is that she assumes the full pain, the full ugly reality of the contradictions of what it means to be an active agent in one's own life, to be a subject, to be an existential creature, as it were. And Emma Bovary is deeply flawed. She is in many ways unlikable. She drags other people down with her. She does not find it in herself to love her child as she ought to. She throws herself into romances that she knows will be unsatisfying. She projects onto other men problems that only she thinks she can solve, thereby creating a necessity and a need for her to intervene. And she loves them so fully that afterwards, the only way to cure herself of this doomed love is to find someone else to love. Which is to say, she is a fully fledged human being. And that is what gives her agency, precisely the fact that she contains these contradictions, that she is flawed, that she is imperfect, that in many ways she is a painful character to watch and observe and identify with. There's a couple of scenes here that I'd like to mention as well. One of them, I think, really cuts to the core of Flaubert's, if you will, satirical contribution. And this takes place after Emma's death. And at her bedside, we have the pharmacist, who believes himself to be a man of reason, of secular values. And then we have the priest who has come in, who wants to, say the last rites and pray for her. And there's a lovely little debate that takes place between the two of them in which they point out a paradox implicit in prayer, which is to say, the priest says, let us pray for her. And the pharmacist says, well, if she didn't accept God, then what use is prayer? And vice versa, if she had already accepted God, then what use is prayer? And the priest says, well, we must pray anyway. We must go through the motions of prayer, even though there is no logical justification for it at this point. And amidst this deathbed scene, their argument becomes increasingly heated. And to the extent that Bovary's husband, who is mourning, simply wants to come and check on his deceased wife, and the priest and the apothecary, the pharmacist, are fighting. Like they're having this comedic debate next to Bovary. It is as if the story of her life simply serves the pretext for the, if you will, vanities and discussions of a time which is emerging in its own unfolding identity in terms of the clash between reason, positivism, and science, and supposedly outdated religiosity, Christianity, and mysticism. In fact, there's a scene where an eminent doctor comes to visit Bovary in her final hours, and he says nothing can be done, and he goes out and is taken out for dinner by the local doctor who simply wants to impress the other by means of his attributes, accolades, etc. It is a vanity fair, as it were. It is a satire. The more grim the book becomes, the more biting it is in its satirical elements. In fact, again, a cinematic image from Flaubert. The priest and the pharmacist have worn themselves out fighting and debating, and with their big bellies in front of them, they fall asleep. And next to the bed, we have here on one side the priest, and on the other side the pharmacist, and all of them appear to be sleeping the sleep of the dead. And yet Flaubert can't resist also being gentle about this. For the next morning, the priest and the pharmacist look at each other, and the pharmacist pats the priest on the shoulder and says, I think we could actually be really good friends after all. This is never a book that is unkind to its characters. There is something gentle, I think, about the way in which Flaubert draws out the contradictions, which, of course, are not unique to any one class or person in society, but as Flaubert suggests, are in fact uniquely universal, which is to say we all experience them. And I think it is in this precise sense that Flaubert's well-known quote, "Bovary c'est moi," should be interpreted. That Bovary is above all a vessel for the exploration of an emergent modernist sensitivity, or if you will, a sensibility that understands and seeks to lay out through the artistic and creative process the vicissitudes of the real. And it is to this project that we give the name realism, and which explains the enduring power of Flaubert's work. In fact, I'll leave you with a great quote about Flaubert's writing process. He says, "The art of writing is the art of discovering what you believe." And perhaps that is the aesthetic project par excellence to which he commits himself in Madame Bovary. To use this book as a way of exploring not just the vicissitudes of realism and the contradictions and hypocrisies of his time, but also to lay out his own very real human and existential contradictions. In fact, we should not forget that Flaubert was 29 years old when he began writing this, and that he meticulously slaved at it, writing only about 14 pages a month and then making even further cuts. He said, "It is so incredibly difficult to try to be simple. It is an attempt to cut and trim the fat of romanticism into a slim, neat, biting novel that gets to the very heart of the human experience." That is Madame Bovary by Flaubert. If you want to read it, which I highly recommend you do, I would suggest the translation by Lydia Davis. And I'm always partial to her work, not only because I enjoy the rhythm of it, but because I think that her essays on translation, contained in her essays volume 1 and volume 2, she has also translated Proust very effectively, have really made me value her approach to translating. And so I feel invested in it. Lydia Davis' translation of Madame Bovary. A quite wonderful book. I highly recommend it. Thank you so much. If you'd like to learn more, if you'd like to go deeper into this project, if you'd like to support these lectures, please do consider becoming a patron. You can go to www.patreon.com/Julian Philosophy, where you can find the full lecture archives as audio downloads. It's more than 100 lectures at this point. My bonus podcast, which I usually record with Jeneline, which we will resume soon, as well as my ebook archives. And I'm currently working on the next ebook, which will be out at the end of the month. I will see you soon. Thank you so much.